It's only with some affection that I offer to my friends from the community. Their biases, much like biases experienced by everybody else. Biases that affect us so much that they actually inhibit our ability to contribute well to this world. Let me start with the first one, which I find the most humorous as well as the most tragic one at the same time. It's a tragic comedy that has happened to us. So rhyme for reason, very interesting. So there are two of them. One is less is more. The other one is form follows function, and they define practically modernism for everybody. Form follows function. Okay, but no, not necessarily. I was probably one of the 100 people who made a rhyme on it. It could have been a meme. So I said, well, what function? I mean, in India, form follows regulation, as it does in multiple places. Why should less only be more? I believe reckless is more, pushing around is more, wickedness is more, subversiveness is more, boldness is more, obsessiveness is more, success is more. Less probably was before, but no more. I think less might be to ignore. We kind of emotionally latch on to these rhymes and buy them as reason. And reason to the extent that defines our philosophical underpinnings as a professional. I find this a bit scary. Entire careers have been driven from these two ridiculously expedient kind of statements. I mean, they're too short to say it all. But that's what human need is, to anchor to something that is easy to digest and to understand. But we must be cognizant of the fact that that may not be true. Just because it sounds nice doesn't mean it is right. Second one, I think, is the egocentric bias. Creative people who are successful at one thing think that they have the ability to do anything. So it turns into a kind of a halo effect. It turns into a false kind of uniqueness bias. It turns into illusory superiority. Time and again, it's been proven that that is indeed not true. Anything that comes out of you has to be world changing. It doesn't have to be. It goes down to the core of what the problem is. It is that you're letting your egocentric bias drive your thinking, and you're imposing it on the entire world. I think we could do with a little bit more of humility, and not necessarily believing that someone who can think up something in Paris can actually design a city in India, for instance. Just making a point. What this links also in some way is to what I call the imposter syndrome. It's like a lot of us are so fearful of not being seen as the geniuses, the natural geniuses that we're supposed to be born as, and somewhere to be caught in the act of not being one. That we run our entire careers and lifetimes trying to justify our ability to do what is actually beyond our capabilities. This time and again, the same story is retold, and we are trying to escape from the obvious that maybe, just maybe, we don't have it in us to do the next big thing. And we don't have to, by the way. It's so much weight of expectation that we put on everyone in our profession. And so the conversations then turn a bit toxic, because everyone holds on to their own little patch, which brings me to the confirmation bias. It is the ability that we have to selectively pass through information and pick only those bits that confirm preconceived notions, completely disregarding anything to the contrary. It goes against the very core principle on which our work should be done, which is with an openness of mind and critical thinking, anchoring us to trivial pursuits, which seem significant to us. I think there's a term for it. It's called Parkinson's effect. You actually disregard large problems by making them academic in some sense, and you spend inordinate amount of time on those aspects of our contribution that really do not matter to others. So this dysfunctionality at the core of it. I also think that it starts from the basic structure in which we analyze what is presented to us. So our methods induce a paralysis actually. I wonder how people even be able to be creative here, because it's what's called the analysis paralysis kind of a paradigm, where there's too much information that we seek, whereas only an appropriate amount of information is sufficient to solve that problem. But we do not have the sense of that appropriateness. And with too much information, we significantly reduce our ability to be decisive about solving problems. Creative people draw from a wide range of information, but they should have the ability to incisively apply it at one place, one time, one situation fairly quickly. I also think that we are far too concerned about wanting to belong into the group that we subscribe to. With the belongingness that we have with any group, it could be a particular kind of education that you got, and therefore you're part of that alumni, or it's your little world that you want to show your talents to. It again becomes dysfunctional because you are driven to belong rather than perform. And then it links back to the confirmation bias, where the notions that you picked up as a part of that group become your defining characteristics. And anything that's from outside the group, which is out group, is actually discriminated against. Groupthink, in some sense, I call it group rope, because we understand this well, that if there are too many people saying the same thing, then most of them are unnecessary. Whereas I believe a lot of people have individual capabilities to come up with something which may exceed the total ability of the group to come up with something. We have a huge pro-innovation kind of bias. There is no architect worth his or her salt who does not think that they have the next great idea to contribute, which may well be true. But this creates that sense of working in a tiny domain because you want to do your own thing. And then it links also back to what's the other bias, which is not invented here. So what anybody else does is not worth your while. Why should it be? Well, I have news for you. There's a term for it. It's called reinventing the wheel. We tend to find ways to reinvent the wheel all the time. We clearly do understand the subtleties of, or should understand the subtleties of human behavior, needs, wants, desires. But we've taken this a bit far in the aspect that's not necessary. So the bias here is, it's a bit of a tongue twister. It's anthropomorphism. I don't know, whoever came up with that must have been an engineer or a disgruntled architect. So it means basically we try and give a human personification to anything. Let's say Earth. Earth becomes Gaia. It's like a mother now. So the moment you do that, you bring in emotion to override your logic, your ability to think critically. And that I think is tragic. We should limit human personification to what is required and where it is required, and not just make that an easy escape to give a moralistic veneer, an ethical veneer to any nonsense that we do. Climate change is an issue that has got linked with such thinking to an extent that there is no critical discussion that you can have on it. It's a faith model now. If you go up against someone who speaks for Mother Earth, Gaia, you are looked at as a heretic. Why? We live in the age of reason. I'm not the one to put faith or logic and reasoning. We are apologists now. Bias on of working on insignificant but conceived as important kind of issues. So we basically lock ourselves into the story where only we are doing what we are doing and nobody else is looking at what we're doing because they're not really significant to others. And I keep reminding people the same thing. We work for others, or just use your own money and have fun. And since we work for others, we better be relevant for others' needs. Not invented here is just arrogance expressed in a polished way, nothing more. And it's ridiculous, frankly. So, all right, two more. One is what I call the publication bias. Actually, I don't call it. It's already called that. So it is significant news over significant achievement. I almost partake in that as much for a bit before I stop publishing. The prime motive for doing something is to create the next significant news. And anybody who denies that is lying here. If it were not to be so, then the best architecture would remain unpublished. I know there's argument to be made for other people to even get it, but it's kind of in your face. We look at newsworthy rather than worthy. It's a problem in the long term because you become basically bards for your own tales. It's slightly angular to the whole story. So, in the very least, we should be aware of that. The publication bias actually draws from what I think might be the bizarreness effect. So it's a valid cognitive bias. So anything that stands out, which is bizarre, which is in normal perception and in normal experience, has a greater chance of being remembered and being published. And professionals tend to towards ideas and solutions that stand out the most and not necessarily the ones that function the best. I'm as much guilty there, but at least I'm aware. And let me end on a more somber note. We have this extraordinary ability actually to put handicaps in front of us. So that's why we would not step out of our little, kitchen garden, because anything that we might do outside might deflate our self-esteem, which links back to the egocentric bias, the halo effect. You are so obsessed with being right every time and to be seen as right that you miss out on what you ought to be doing actually in some sense, or could be doing. I'm not insisting that is necessary. Is this just because it's driven by fear, so you should fear it a little bit. So I love my architect friends and my fraternity far too much to actually use this kind of a rambling thing to denigrate them in any way. I just want to remind them that they are human such as everybody else. It's strange that I have to remind them. So they are taught to be naturally known, but it's not. These biases are pretty common, but the effects they can have can be wonderful and catastrophic at the same time. I do not deny the fact that that some of your borderline psychotic behaviors are the ones that make you special in some way, but not the ones that limit you and your ability to perform well in this world. And clearly the case has to be made now that we are failing somewhere in that. And it might be a good opportunity to just open up our minds to what many others know to be true anyways. That fundamentally human beings are designed to make shortcuts in thinking, and biases being one of them. And our biases are a problem to be dealt with now. Pleasure being here.